Hi, Tara Kiesling here with Together We Will. I'm here with Michelle Dillingham. We'll be going Facebook Live any minute now. We're waiting for multiple groups to sync up, so just bear with us for a couple minutes while we have all the groups join us. Well, they told us we could be silly at this point, but I don't know what that means.
Don't have any jokes prepared.
So I think we're syncing up with Together We Will Eastside, United We Stand, we're linking up with an Indivisible group possibly too. So welcome everybody. For those of us that are, or for those of you that are with us, remember you can ask questions at any point, and I'll be kind of monitoring them on my screen, and I'll ask them to Michelle once we get started here. If you're just joining us now, welcome. Like I said, we're waiting for the different groups around town to sync up with each other. We have a mic coming.
Do you have a mic coming? Here, just leave to it. Alright, so we forgot the mic. There we go. Leave that under? There we go.
Just put it right here.
Yeah, either side.
Okay.
This is live. So if you're joining us, welcome. We're waiting for a bunch of groups to sync up with this Facebook Live post. This is Michelle Dillingham, candidate for Cincinnati City Council.
Hello.
We'll get started any minute now once I get the go-ahead from everybody. We have the microphone all set up. I will try and speak louder this time
Testing
around.
1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Welcome. If you're joining us, we're here with Michelle Dillingham, candidate for Cincinnati City Council. We're waiting for multiple groups around Cincinnati to sync up. We have an Indivisible group, we have United We Stand, we have Together We Will, which is where I'm from, and Together We Will Eastside. And remember, at any point you can ask Michelle questions live, and I will answer, ask them to her. So whatever you're curious about as far as issues go.
So we could chit chat maybe. I know,
yeah.
you know, other hot news in the election cycle is that on May 2nd we have a mayoral primary happening, and of course that doesn't include council candidates. That's just candidates running for mayor. But I know for myself it's a good time to engage with voters, because the people that come out to vote for the mayor in the mayor's race are usually your highly engaged voters that are really keyed into the local elections. And so that's just in about a month, right? April 2nd?
Yeah.
May 2nd. May 2nd is the mayoral primary. And then that will narrow the field down to 2 candidates for mayor, and then we have an at-large council race. So we have 9 seats for Cincinnati City Council. There's 9 seats plus mayor. So there'll be, I'm not sure how many people will be actually running for city council at this point. On average, there's typically between 23 and 28 people that run for 9 seats, pretty much on average. Given the fact that we now have a 4-year term, some people think that field will be even larger, just given the fact that you have to wait so much longer to run. But my prediction is I think there'll still be about the same amount of people running. And the deadline to file to be a candidate is in August. I think it's August 9th, but I could be wrong about that exact date. But it's 90 days prior to the general election date, which is November 7th. One time here. Just politics 101.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people showed interest in possibly running, so if
it's not too late. I mean, so if you want to get on the ballot for November 7th for the at-large city council race in Cincinnati, you have to gather 500 valid signatures on a petition and submit them by August 9th. It looks like we're all good to go.
Okay, awesome. Well, our first question is, what are your exact responsibilities to the city and your constituents And it's kind of a two-part question.
I wonder if should we do the introduction or
Oh,
something?
yes, we should do the introduction. Yes. Sorry about that. This is Michelle Dillingham. She's candidate for Cincinnati City Council. She has a long and impressive resume, and I'm just going to highlight a few parts of it, but if you have a chance to check out her website, it's all on there. Very, very impressive, a lot of involvement. She went to graduate school and got a graduate degree in social work at UC. She worked at City Hall for former Vice Mayor David Crowley. She's currently the CEO of Community Shares and has worked on issues ranging from housing to food access to public education to employment for individuals with disabilities. If you're joining us now, welcome. I think all of the groups are synced up. We have a few groups here at Facebook Live. And feel free to ask questions on any of the posts, and we'll capture them on my computer over here, and I'll ask them live on air. So I'm going to throw it over to Michelle if you'd like to give any more of an intro.
Sure. We were just killing time earlier kind of talking about the Cincinnati City Council race, but of course I'm one of the candidates running for, there are 9 seats at City Hall. It's a 4-year term, and I'm one of the people hoping to earn your vote November 7th. And again, it's a 4-year term, and members of City Council have a huge influence on how our city, evolves and is run and decisions made. So I'm really glad people are tuning in, getting educated on the local candidates. It's good to be here.
And hooking into what Michelle was saying earlier, it's not too late to run if you'd like to run, but even if you would not like to run, if you see a candidate that you're very interested in and you like what they have to say and you believe in them, I'm sure no one would turn down a volunteer for their campaign. So consider that. Check out a website, check out a candidate.
Yeah.
It's the perfect time to do that. So I'll go ahead and get started with the questions. This one is kind of a long one, so I'll see if I can break it down as much as I can. What are your exact responsibilities to the city and your constituents, and how do you plan to address the needs of all of your constituents, not just those in your party?
Right. So the responsibility of a city council member is to direct policy. We also approve the budget, and so there's a lengthy budget process. Typically how it works is the mayor will come up with a budget, the city manager will come up with a budget, and then it gets sent over to city council, where council members will also put in their hopes of things that they'd like to see in the budget. And ultimately it's the 9 members of city council who approve the budget of the city. So it's a major responsibility and influence.
What would you say sets you apart from other candidates running for city council?
Yes. Well, I think what makes me uniquely qualified is the fact that number one, I have a long, lengthy career in administrative social work. So working in the nonprofit sector on some of the toughest issues that our city and our citizens have faced. Also the fact that I've worked at City Hall. So I actually got the opportunity to work in an office as a legislative aide and chief of staff for former Vice Mayor David Crowley. And what that means is I actually essentially supported a council member in their work. I helped, David at the time, he chaired the Health, Human Services and Environment Committee. And so all legislation and policy that related to health, environment, and education came through his office, and so managing all of that policy and legislation, actually having hands-on experience doing that. So I think uniquely qualified in terms of both having the experience of doing the job already, and also the real-world experience of having to manage a budget, balance budgets as a administrative manager over a nonprofit, and just kind of who I am. I am sort of been someone who's really been out there as a sort of activist advocate on a lot of issues, have written extensively opinion pieces in the paper on things I'm very passionate about. And so, I'm already, like I said, when I ran in 2013, although I didn't win, I continued to fight for and work on the issues that I ran on. So, yeah.
Going back to a budget question, how do you think the city can best balance the budget and help the deficient?
best balance the budget and help the deficit?
That's a deficit, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a question from the audience.
Okay, so restate it again. How would?
How do you think the city can best balance the budget and help
Okay.
the deficit?
Oh, that's a great question, because that is like a key question, right, of managing the city, which is making sure the budget is balanced. And, you know, so when you look, it's just like any budget of any company or your household budget. You look at what's coming in, what's going out. And I like to focus, you know, what's going out is hugely important. It's safety, fire and police, infrastructure, you know, roads, bridges, sidewalks. It's also a little tiny bit of human services that supports food pantries and housing. It's also some environmental work. So here's the budget, and this is what we spend our money on. Now the question is, what's coming in? And of course, how we support all that is through property taxes, earned income tax, fees. And what I like to talk about is that I'd like to see our city have things that a great city has, right? Good public transportation, good fire and safety, and parks and beautification. Well, we need money for all those things. And what we know is that we are sort of hemorrhaging money in a few different ways that I've drawn attention to over the years. One is corporate subsidies, giving away sort of, it's in the name of economic development and incentives, but research has shown, across many cities are figuring this out, that the corporate welfare that we're giving out doesn't always have a good return on investment that we think it does. So I think a fresh look at that is important. And in fact, there was recently a study done by the city about how we give out tax incentives. Because when we give those out, it's really giving away money. Other things include looking just at the way we have a property tax rollback, different fees that we leverage. So as a seated member of City Council, that's the job, right? Is to look at what are we spending, what are we bringing in, what makes sense, what doesn't, and how can we be fiscally responsible and prudent and yet meet all the needs of our city. So that's a big question. I can't do it in 2 minutes probably, but.
What do you think is the city's biggest challenge for the next 3 years? And what do you think the solution is? So you guys are throwing awesome questions. These are big questions to ask. And
no, those are good questions. So the biggest challenge in the next 3 years, you know, I think what everybody mostly knows is that if you just look at Cincinnati right now, yes, we have, you know, beautiful neighborhoods and we have cultural and arts and some great stuff going on. But our key issues really are the fact that, you know, almost half our families are living below the federal poverty line. So we have a lot of underemployed people, unemployed people, people working 2 and 3 jobs and still not making enough to make ends meet. So that is key to really preventing us from being the city that we really could be for all of us. 2, I think, is sort of gun violence. I mean, you know, we just had a sort of mass shooting, some people are calling it. I mean, multiple people shot this morning. And so I always said, you can make Over the Rhine as pretty as you want. You can have as many gelato bars and hot yoga clubs as you want. But if bullets are flying across the street, nothing makes sense, right? So for me, that's critical, is if we are living in a city where bullets are flying around, we have to focus on that.
What programs would you propose or implement to reduce the number of incidents of gun violence in the city?
Yeah, that's a good question. So gun violence as a whole, of course, is extremely complex. But what I'll tell you is a quick little story is when I worked for former Vice Mayor David Crowley, at first I was a grad student. I was a social work grad student. And at that time, we had just seen a record high homicide rate. This was in 2006. And the question was, what can be done to stem gun violence in our city? And so, of course, like the good grad student I was, I did a lot of research. And at the time, the elected officials took a trip to Chicago, where, you know, full circle, Chicago still has an extremely high homicide rate. By the time they were instituting some initiatives around looking at gun violence as a public health issue And so by doing that, treating it very differently than sort of a moral deficiency or something wrong with those people doing gun violence, but that it was way more complex than that. And so fast forward, we have today a sophisticated menu of things that can be done to address gun violence, all around from gun safety, as simple as gun storage issues and access to licensing and training, all the way to precipitating factors of people unleashing gun violence, like from mental health and trauma reduction, and all the way to gun laws, access to guns. And so the good news is that even though it's a complex problem, there's a complexity of a lot of things that we can do to address it. And a lot of it takes political will. I found out in my research that the CDC at the federal level is prohibited from studying gun violence as a public health issue, and of course we know that's because of the influence of the gun lobby. I was connected in with Mothers Against Gun Violence early on, and advocacy, these groups that are watching right now, the people watching right now, you are the ones, I'm the one who we have to stand up, and we have to start making sense around gun violence issues. And so in the interest of time, I'll leave it at that. But
do you recognize any unjust shootings in Cincinnati in recent years? If so, which?
Yeah. Well, philosophically for me, I'd like to think almost all homicide by gun shooting is unjust, right? I'd like to think that we have enough tools where we can de-escalate a situation without it ending up with a citizen being dead. Yes.
That connects into how would you encourage fair prosecution of unjust police shootings?
Yeah. Well, the whole prosecution question, in my experience, a lot of it falls to the Hamilton County and the whole Sheriff's Department and the prosecutor's office and all of that. But what we do know is that, just from a fundamental level, is that the more money you have, the better lawyers you have, the more likely you are to get out of, charges. So the whole justice system as a whole, I think, needs to be, we know this, making sure that there's equity there and that there's fairness and that there's justice.
Going back to public health, what is the city's responsibility related to public health?
So public health is a really important one. In our city's charter, which is sort of like our constitution, City Council's charge is to ensure the health and safety of our citizenry. The health and safety, that is like our mission statement as elected officials on City Council. And so health, of course, is right up there at the top. So public health is extremely important. I remember when I worked at City Hall, we used to have city employees who would go in and monitor our nursing homes. We also had city workers who go in and monitor our restaurants. So we have, a pool of people who the city employs to monitor different aspects of public health. And we have health clinics as well. Now, of course, it all comes back to resources, right? So we know that we are under-resourced in terms of making sure that every person in Cincinnati has access to good public health. And that can be from HIV testing all the way to, making sure our restaurants are serving healthy food. So that's always been a tension in the city budget, is those areas of the city budget that are devoted to public health always face cuts, unfortunately. And it's important, I think, to have elected officials so that if you vote for me and I'm elected, I'm someone who would definitely prioritize public health as something important to local government. There are some people I won't even get into the Democrat versus Republican because there's such a wide array, but there are some people who've been elected in our past that don't think that public health is a matter of local government. that really all local government needs to worry about is police and fire. Everything else should be left up to, the private sector. So, but I'm not one of those people. I believe that public health is an issue, is a responsibility of local government. Yeah.
This is a two-parter as well. What will you do to support women's health care in Southwest Ohio, and how will you support Planned Parenthood specifically? Okay.
So, women's health. Women's health is supported in many ways through our city budget, from our health clinics to, I'm thinking about even just from the environmental standpoint. We are one of the most polluted cities. We have one of the worst air quality in the whole country. So almost everything you could argue affects women, right? And so again, just reiterating the support of initiatives that would support public health and public safety. But specifically to Planned Parenthood, I happen to work for a nonprofit now. We do fundraising for Planned Parenthood. So I'm very much experienced with the challenges of that we have a very small but very loud group that likes to vilify Planned Parenthood. But what I know, what many know, is that Planned Parenthood provides critical prevention and STD testing and other sorts of testing, breast cancer screening, all of that. They provide an essential function in our city for women's health. And so it has been a challenge for people running for public office to sometimes take these positions because, I've had people tell me, well, I'm not voting for you because you just said that. And I understand that. There are single issue voters. But hopefully what I hope is that what you're hearing from me is that I support women's health and that I recognize that in our city, in lieu of some other thing that might come in, for right now, our Planned Parenthood provides an essential function for women's health in our city right now, and I would publicly support that.
So this is going back to a comment you made about the environment earlier. Mm-hmm. What is the current condition of Cincinnati's water treatment plants? Are they overloaded? And how does this affect the water in the Mill Creek and Ohio River? And I can break that down into smaller parts if that makes more sense.
Right. So I will just be transparent in saying that I am not an expert right now on our water overflow sewer system. I know that what my knowledge base is that we are under federal consent decree that's been going on for many years to address our combined sewer overflow. That means when there's heavy, heavy rains and our sewers overflow because our whole infrastructure wasn't up to date, we actually have raw sewage dumping into our streams where we drink water. So I believe that we are in the process of fixing that through a multi-year consent decree project. I think where the real debate has been coming that you might have heard in the public is around the management of MSD and the projects and how the projects are being done. One of the other groups that I help raise money for in my day job is ECO, and they're a local advocacy group who is asking for more transparency and accountability around MSD. It's been a really difficult governmental entity to get real answers from because of the way it's managed. It's managed by the county, run by the city, or other way around. I'm even confused sometimes. But it's this weird hybrid management thing where both the county and the city have a piece of it, and neither one, sometimes gives you the whole story. So I know a lot of environmentalists locally who have for many years been working on making sure that consent decree goes the way it should be going.
This is connecting to that, so maybe you've kind of touched on this question a little bit. What plans do you have regarding the ongoing battle between the city and the county over upgrading our sewer system? So how would you tackle this butting of heads?
Right. Well, in fact, it's actually in our charter. Again, our charter is like our Constitution, where there was this agreement 50 years ago where the county would have this certain relationship and the city would have this other sort of relationship. And that will be expiring during the term, during this 4-year term that I'm running for. And so the question will come before City Council, what will the new management look like for this massive infrastructure oversight department of our city? I'm not taking a position right now because I'd certainly want to be fully informed of both the intended and unintended consequences of any change to how that's managed. But to the degree that we can increase citizen input and engagement in it, I mean, that's where it always falls. Yeah.
So we have another question from the audience here, and remember, at any point you can send a question in live, and I will be asking Michelle. What is your view of Cincinnati being a sanctuary city?
Okay. So from my understanding, this resolution was like a statement that said, we are a sanctuary city, we are a welcoming city to, we are a welcoming city. And from my understanding, it did not change the way we practice policing in our city. It was simply a sort of symbolic. And so, of course, I support that, right? I support the fact that among us, there are lots of people, men, women, and children, who are living here who don't yet have documentation, citizen documentation. And yet they pay taxes, they participate in our city, they are our neighbors, they are children in our classrooms, and to the extent that we welcome them, I'm for that, Now, beyond that, the question of what does the police do versus the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department, I think that's the next stage of okay, it's great that the city made this statement, but really where the rub is with the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department and those detentions happening and, if detentions are happening. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I appreciate the symbolism and the statement, and I support that. But I always believe there's more to be done for justice, always. Surely we are not there yet with making sure that our neighbors are feeling welcomed. Yeah.
Do you support legislation guaranteeing members of the LGBTQ community the ability to adopt? Would you oppose legislation limiting this right?
Yes, I would oppose legislation limiting the rights of LGBTQ individuals of adopting. I mean, we are in a crisis of adoption right now. There are far too many children who don't have permanent families. And if someone who happens to identify as LGBTQ wants to adopt, I have no problem with that.
It's easy enough. Do you support legislation guaranteeing transgender individuals the ability to use the public restrooms in which they feel safest? Mm-hmm. Would you oppose legislation limiting this right?
Yes, I would oppose legislation limiting that right.
Okay. What public safety policies and initiatives do you support, and how will you allocate funding to support these plans?
Related to what? Just anything?
Public safety.
Oh, yeah. Public safety.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, what initiatives would I put forward to support public safety, and how would I fund them?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay.
So how would you allocate that funding?
Right. Well, just off the top of my head, we have this pot of money at the city called CDGB, which is Community Development Block Grant dollars. This is a federal block grant funding. And at one point, this is a point of haggling really over among the 9 members of City Council, is how to prioritize those dollars. And in the most recent iteration of that, some of you may remember Mayor Cranley diverted some of those dollars and defunded some programs that went to gun violence prevention, and instead shuffled it over to what he called the Hand Up Initiative, which is essentially job training programs. And so at the time I publicly opposed that. I wrote an open letter in the newspaper, and I was on the CDGB advisory board at the time. And given the fact that I was on that board and knowing how that process went, I was particularly opposed to how that went down. But the point is that there are pots and pools of money in our city budget that at one time or another have been devoted to addressing gun violence. And sometimes they're pulled away and sometimes they're given back. And I think here we are in 2017 facing already a real uptick in gun violence. And we could take a fresh look at certainly making sure that those programs in prevention are supported. The other program is the Cincinnati Initiative to Reduce Violence, or SERVE. I was fortunate enough to be one of the very, very beginning early people that staffed that initiative on behalf of Vice Mayor David Crowley. Originally, we called it Ceasefire Cincinnati, modeled after the Ceasefire Chicago. It later turned into a full program of the city that includes both the carrot and the stick of gun violence prevention. So the part of that program that I really respect is the street outreach part, where you have men and women who actually are of the community, part of the community, experience some of the very same challenges, going out and doing some interventions. So that's just another example where they're funding over time. Every time there's a new council, sometimes they have to fight for those dollars. And I am someone who would definitely support that kind of programming.
How will you support diversity training for LEOs,
law enforcement
officers, and first responders in dealing with mental illness and unconscious bias?
Right, so this question is getting at the fact that in policing, just like in any profession, my profession is social work, we acknowledge that we come into any situation with bias, right? In our own perspective, in our own lens. But when you're in law enforcement, the ante is really up, because you're in an intensely stressful situation. Your very personal safety is, at play. And best practices in that field have said that it's important for law enforcement to receive diversity training around mental illness, of course, and all that, just to have a broader understanding. I know in my own profession, we go through hours and hours of professional, we call it continuing education units, CEUs. I'm getting echo, that's okay. So the point is that, yes, continuing education is a good thing. Training is a good thing, and especially for our law enforcement officers, because they're under so much literally life-threatening situations. They need all the support they can get, and they should get it.
How will you improve accessibility in Cincinnati? Issues include more accessible buses, TTY for phones instead of relay, accessibility of jails and City Hall, interpreters and captions for live events.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. Accessibility. Of course, some of you who know me may know that my husband, Chris, and I, we have a son. His name is Michael. And Michael is 20 years old now, and Michael has cerebral palsy, so he uses a wheelchair. And so our every moment of life, accessibility is always a question. Like wherever we go, whatever we do, we have to factor in access, right? And so I am someone who's particularly sensitive to that issue, and I would certainly do all that I can in my power to make sure that our city is truly accessible. There are many parts of our city that are still very inaccessible. Public transportation is my biggest grievance, or I should say my son's biggest grievance. Our experience with the lack of accessible taxis, the paratransit system is awful in the city. Prohibitive, actually. I mean, literally, Michael would not be employable if it were not for me driving him places, because access is so undependable. So it's, again, a matter of resources. And I forgot the original question, but I think you asked about what would I do about access. I mean, everything I could possibly do, and there's so much that can be done. And it's not always just the 9 people sitting up at the dais, at City Hall. It's a matter of engaging with the communities that are affected. They are typically the ones with the best ideas on how to improve things. And to the extent that local government can support those ideas, that's what we should be doing. Yeah.
Hooking into transportation. How will you help alleviate poverty in Cincinnati by improving the bus system and public transportation? Right. So most people know that the bus system in Cincinnati is really frustrating. From the fleet, the fact that our fleet is extremely aging, our bus routes don't always make sense. You have to do a lot of transfers, and it's just not really planned well, meaning like if I want to get across town, it'll probably take me an hour and a half with the transfer. So public transportation, I'll tell you this, I like to go to cities. I love cities, right? I've lived in a lot of different cities. When I travel, especially with our son in a wheelchair, public transportation is a key factor in our experience of a city, And I think the greatest cities are those that have a really sophisticated public transit system that works for everyone. And so the question is for Cincinnati, how are we going to get there? And what was the question? What is it? How can we leave? So, of course, I think those watching get the connection between poverty and transit, but maybe not everybody does, but clearly, to get to work, you have to have good transit. So the question is, how are we going to invest in our transit system to make it work for everyone? There are lots of ideas. Again, back to the simplistic explanation of what's coming in versus what's going out. How can we pull in more funds? Or how can we draw down more funds from the federal and the state? How can we, have cost savings in other areas to free up funding that really public transit needs desperately? Those are the tough questions that elected officials need to answer. And I know for me, being new, being someone who has not been in office year after year, a non-incumbent, coming in fresh, really not beholden to the corporate Fortune 500 constituency here, I'm willing to take the tough, questions of looking at, earned income tax. I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to look at really holding our state and federal officials more responsible for transit funding for our cities. I have a reputation of not being afraid to call things out and to strongly advocate, and usually it's from a place of my personal empowerment because I'm experiencing this frustration personally. So when I get up and I talk about transit, I'm like thinking about my son and how frustrating it is for our family. And so I have no problem really challenging the status quo in those areas. And, with your vote, if I am elected, I can do that. And if you're just joining us, at the end of this video, you'll be able to rewatch it. We're here with Michelle Dillingham, candidate for Cincinnati City Council. At any point, you can send in a live question, and I'll read it out loud for her to answer. Our next question is, generally, what are your plans for underserved or in-need communities?
Plans for underserved. Well, that question implies that some communities are being served better than others, and we know that's true. So City Hall and city government and our city budget, there are opportunities there for supporting, investing, engaging, leveraging development or investment in our different communities. We know, that certain neighborhoods, I've been on the neighborhood side of things, and I call myself the neighborhood candidate because I was, for over a decade, I served on the Kennedy Heights Community Council, and we had to sort of compete for resources from City Hall, for different investment in our business district or different grants. And so, I have a limited time to answer these really complicated questions because I get the 2-minute mark signed, but I just want to say that it's a matter of political will for the elected official who's in there to acknowledge that there's inequity, and that elected official is saying, and I'm saying to you, that I'll be someone who definitely is open and proactive in engaging with all our communities to make sure that we're doing the most that we can to support them in the ways that we can. And that's what you need. That's what we want from City Hall. I know I want an elected official who's going to respond to me and work with me as a neighborhood leader to figure out how we can improve our neighborhood. So I have experience in that on both sides, and I'm really looking forward to doing that work if I'm elected.
As Michelle said, these are very complicated questions, and each question, we have so many, only gets 2 minutes each. So if there's anything that you're not getting enough of, feel free to visit her website, michelledillingham.com, right?
It's actually votedillingham.com.
Sorry about that. So feel free to visit, and there's more information there. Keep asking your questions. I'm reading them live right now. So this kind of hooks into the beginning of our Q&A section. How can we, as your constituents, hold you accountable? What's the best way for us to communicate with you?
Right. So this is a great question. People who are elected to City Hall work for you, the taxpayers, the citizens, and there's a responsibility there to be responsive, to be accountable. I worked at City Hall for almost 4 years for a man who, it was his policy that every person who called in, wrote in, emailed in, got a response and a referral if needed. I want to bring that back to City Hall. Good old-fashioned constituent casework where you can really feel that you're being heard, that you're being listened to, and that we are working. I worked in a working council office. I can tell you that not every person at City Hall is a working office. In fact, the reputation was such that they knew that if they called David Crowley's office, they were going to get an answer. And so we ended up starting to get all the calls because people knew if they called David, they would get an answer. And I want to, he was my mentor, and I want to bring that spirit back. It's also a professional ethos of mine as a social worker of being responsive and being an active listener and being proactive. I'm also someone, what people might not understand is lots of legislation comes by the desk. And then every Wednesday there's a council meeting, and you get there and there's maybe 75 to 100 items on the agenda. And you have to cast a vote for each item. Well, a lot of times the politicians will show up and, they'll get a cursory understanding of what's on there and be like, okay, yeah. The guy I worked for would have the administration come into his office and explain each development project, each policy that the administration was presenting, making sure that there was true, authentic engagement on that issue, that there was buy-in, who was being left out, who was not at the table. It was a very intentional way of governing, and that is what I look forward to doing, is a very intentional way of making these decisions that is inclusive and authentic in terms of engaging those who are directly affected by these decisions. So that's where I think you can see, hopefully you will understand that that's how you get the accountability from me, is that those votes, those decisions, before a vote is cast, those communities that are affected are certainly, I would reach out to you and say, do you know about this? Are you comfortable with it? What is your perspective on this?
That sounds like democracy. What is your plan for taking on racial healing in this community, and how does it differ from what has been done in the past?
Yes, racial healing. I'll be the first to say that I am not you know, I'm only an expert in what I know, you know, and so a big value of mine is really listening and learning. I know what I've been learning in the last few years in some of my work is this concept of naming it, right? Just the act of calling out when there is issues of race is so important, because I think there's this thing about Cincinnati where a lot of times we just don't even want to say anything or call it out, or, you know, because there's so much beneath that people are worried about. Well, if I just don't say anything, you know, it'll just go by and we can just pretend it's not there. But we know that that is not the answer, right? So, I mean, simply someone to have the courage to just name it and to say, there appears to be something going on here related to race, you know, let's talk about it. There's been these great community conversations going on. The Cincinnati Human Relations Commission, CHRC, is actually a project of, you know, it's part of city government. They do some amazing work. Their whole project is really about racial healing. And so as a seated council member, that's another initiative that I would definitely support and hopefully expand, because we need it. And again, they're another one who typically gets on the chopping block around budget time. So these are the kinds of things that someone in that position can support through the budget and both, and also just by naming it. Yeah.
How will you ensure that public schools are providing comparable and competitive education, regardless of the race or economic status of their students?
Yeah. Well, this is a good question. You know, I've heard some say, why does anybody ask a candidate for city council about education? There's the Board of Education, and they're over schools. City council has nothing to do with it. Well, I disagree with that. I think those seated at City Hall have quite a bit to say about public education in our city. First of all, public schools are the cornerstone of neighborhoods. The school is integral to the life of the family. And so to the extent that people at City Hall can be encouraging and supporting and engaging around the issues of schools, they should be. And so the short answer is, for 3 years, I led the Cincinnati Educational Justice Coalition, and our work was to uplift public education and to make sure it was being supported. There's way more I could talk about on that, don't have time, but suffice it to say that I am a major supporter of public education, and that I would do all that I could in my power to support our public schools.
We have a question from the audience. What is your view of City Council engaging our youth? How would you engage Cincinnati Public Schools to support your views?
Right. So the youth, you know, one thing that just struck me is, some of you may know, council member Yvette Simpson is running for mayor. Because she's running for mayor, it means she can't run for city council again. She has been that council member who's really led the charge on youth, around youth employment, youth programming, and just the loss of her on city council. You know, I mean, she may win, she may become our mayor, which is great, but she won't be a legislator. Some people might not understand that when you're mayor, you don't actually legislate. You put things on or off the agenda, but you don't actually craft policy. And so we'll lose that person. We will lose a woman who's been on city council, who's really led the charge around youth programs and employment, and I'm someone who I hope to step into that. I would like to take up what she has been doing successfully, and that is making sure that Cincinnati youth have experiences and access to as much as they can. Yeah.
Let's see. What will you do to combat the heroin epidemic? I know it's a completely different kind of question.
Well, you know, drugs have been around forever. And, you know, we've had epidemics of drug use, you know, for years. This new iteration of this drug is such that we are seeing people die quickly. And so it's sort of heightened this intense urgency of that there are all these people and young people that aren't just, you know, losing things and losing their job and destroying their lives, but like they're dying. I mean, I've been to a lot of funerals lately. I happen to be a person in long-term recovery. I have 19 years clean, and I didn't share that when I ran in 2013 because there's still a lot of stigma around drug use and being an addict. But I figured, hey, I have almost 20 years clean, so if somebody's going to judge me, then whatever. Also, I raise it because what it tells you is that I come from a perspective of sort of the disease concept of addiction, recognizing that this is not a moral issue for people. This is literally a medical issue. And so to the extent that we address it in those terms, we need to do that. A huge question, no way I can answer it in 30 seconds, but what I want you to know is that I would be an elected official who would be very open to working on that and working in the coalitions that already exist that have formed around this issue. I'm a huge fan of coalition and partnership work. That's my experience professionally. I believe in it. I know it works. And any tough issue that we face has to be solved really in coalition. So.
Do you oppose so-called religious freedom legislation, which allows for discrimination on the basis of one's religious beliefs?
Yes, I mean, if someone is doing business with the city and using any taxpayer incentives or help, that is just prohibited. You cannot discriminate. In terms of the private sector, I think it gets a little more dicey, but just speaking, I don't think a member of City Council will have a lot to say about that issue in the private sector, but what I would hope, what I know is that discrimination is not good for business. It just isn't. And I would not support anything around our city that would uphold discrimination. Yeah.
So there's a question, and actually it was one of the earlier questions that we asked, but it's from the audience, so I'm going to ask you again. So if you're just joining us now, this is a new question for you, and if you've been here all along, this is repeat.
Maybe I'll answer it differently.
What separates you from other candidates that are running for Cincinnati City Council?
Right. Well, that's a good question, and you know, again, you know, I'm bringing myself to this work. You know, I mean, it's a job description, you know, city council member. And what does that person do? You know, they set policy, they approve a budget, they may do some other sort of symbolic stuff like ribbon cutting and, you know, showing up at events. But for me, I'm bringing myself to this job, and who I am is someone who literally loves policy work. I enjoy the work of crafting legislation and policy that makes our city a better place for everyone. Getting into the weeds, you know, making the sausage, like they say. You know, when you say, well, you need 5 votes to get anything done at City Hall, it's more than that. It's pulling people together. It's coming up with solutions to tough issues. It's making sure everyone's included in that process, so when the solution's presented, there's buy-in. I mean, it's a very nuanced and sophisticated role. And because of my experience professionally, doing coalition work, doing partnership work, doing advocacy, I bring that skill set with me. I already do it already. You voting me into City Hall is helping elevate my work, so that I can bring what I've already been able to accomplish to another level. And I feel like my voice is important at City Hall. A lot of times it's lawyers or developer type people or people who maybe have a whole lot of money because honestly, a lot of times the way people get elected is just through name recognition. It's buying up a lot of TV time or radio time and just spending a ton of money. I'm a candidate who is not independently wealthy. I'm a grassroots candidate. I'm someone who literally knocked doors for months in 2013. I came very close to winning. I won more than half our wards in our city, top 9 in 2013. So what I bring to this position is unique because I'm someone who has really already been out there working on a lot of these issues. And so that's what I bring.
If you have any questions, feel free to send them in now. We're coming up to the end of this Q&A session. So if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. So Michelle, where do you look for inspiration and ideas?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I am like the biggest don't reinvent the wheel person. So anytime I'm coming up on a challenge, I always reach out and see who else is doing this work, who else is, able to make some things happen. And so my inspiration is really looking at best practices in those fields, in those areas of challenge. I believe that every great new initiative that cities bring in, typically they've borrowed it or somehow changed it from something that's worked in another city. So I'm very much open to collaboration and looking for great ideas and bringing them to Cincinnati. Yeah.
We have another question from the audience here. What do you think about the development and changes in Over the Rhine?
Oh yeah. So development in and of itself is not bad. The question is development being done in a way that's preserving sort of the soul and the people that lived there before? I worked at the Greater Cincinnati Coalition for the Homeless for almost 2 years. During that time, we did a lot of educating and work around issues of privatization of public spaces like Washington Park and also gentrification issues. We know that there have been many people displaced in the, quote, renaissance of Over the Rhine. I used to write articles about the fact that, of course, I want to walk through a park that's beautiful and I want a spray park for my grandkids to play in. And sure, I like food trucks and I like flowers on the street. No one's saying that they don't want improvements. The question is why weren't those improvements done before the entire, that space was turned over to a private for-profit corporation? So I am very tuned into issues around privatization, and so that's an issue that seriously takes more than 2 minutes. But what that tells you is I am someone who is going to be very sensitive to development projects that come across my desk, making sure that the people that are still living there are included and that can participate and that they have access to those changes. Not all development is good development when it harms the very people of our city. Yeah.
So this is a very pointed question. It relates to the previous question. What do you think about gentrification?
Well, the definition of gentrification, I believe, I shouldn't give an exact definition because it might not be accurate, but my understanding of it is that you displace poor people of lower incomes for people of higher incomes. And I am against that.
How will you work, and I'm going to wrap this up. This will be the final question, so thank you for joining us. How will you work within the council and local governments to move the city forward?
Right. Well, the bottom line is not one person can get anything done. You have to work collaboratively. You have to work across the aisle, like they say, with people who might not share your same perspective or viewpoints. But I am someone who has a track record of doing that. I served as a statewide commissioner for a state department, the state of Ohio, I was a commissioner, and I was one of the only Democrats there, and yet I was on the finance committee, and I work well with others. Let's just say that, because these things are just too important to just clam up and say, well, forget it. I don't agree with them, and I'm just not going to even try. No way. It is incumbent upon anyone elected to City Hall to give it 110%. To tackle these tough issues, and we can do it. It's just a matter of getting people elected who are willing to work together. So I hope that you'll give me your vote so I can do that.
Do you have any closing statements and maybe any social media or website handles that people could check out more information?
Well, it is really easy to get in touch with me on Facebook, Michelle Dillingham for Council, Facebook, Vote Dillingham on my website. There's a way to message me. I need your help to get elected. I hope that you may not agree with everything I've said, but I hope that you have heard from me that I'm someone who wants to work for you and am open-minded and willing to be open to new ideas, and that I will work hard, and that I am someone of the people. I come in with sort of a unique story, both as a mother of a child with special needs, someone who's in the recovery world. I'm a social worker, so I think I hope you agree with me that I would make a great council member for Cincinnati, and any way you can help me do that, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.